She was a young woman who worked quietly in a large and busy event venue. Most people there never really noticed her. She was not part of the spotlight, not part of the important meetings, and not part of the stage performances that people came to see. She was simply one of the support staff who made sure everything stayed clean, organized, and ready for the guests who arrived every day. Her work was simple, but she did it with care. She always arrived on time, always followed instructions, and always tried to stay invisible in the background. That was how everyone expected her to be. The venue itself was one of the most well-known places in the city. Important events were held there almost every week. Sometimes there were business gatherings where powerful people discussed deals that could change entire companies. Sometimes there were cultural nights where music, speeches, and performances filled the grand hall. From the outside, it looked like a world full of excitement and importance. But for her, it was a place of routine tasks, long hours, and quiet corners where she often found herself alone. She never complained about her job. In fact, she was thankful for it. It helped her support her life, and it gave her a sense of stability. But deep inside, there was something she carried with her every single day that no one around her knew. It was not something she talked about, not even with the people she worked closely with. It was her connection to music. Since she was very young, she had been drawn to sound in a way she could not fully explain. While other children played outside or spent time on games, she would often sit quietly near old radios or broken instruments she found at home. The piano, in particular, fascinated her. She remembered the first time she touched one. It was in a small community hall where someone had left it unattended after an event. She was allowed to press a few keys, and even though she did not know how to play properly at that time, the sound stayed with her for days. As she grew older, she never had formal training. There were no music schools nearby that she could attend, and her family could not afford private lessons. But she did not let that stop her curiosity. Whenever she had free time, she would find ways to practice. Sometimes she would watch others play from a distance. Sometimes she would memorize patterns in her mind just by listening carefully. And sometimes, late at night, she would hum melodies quietly to herself, imagining what they would sound like on a real piano. Music became her secret world, a world she carried inside her while living an ordinary life on the outside. At the venue, no one ever imagined that the quiet staff member who cleaned tables or arranged chairs could have any connection to music. To them, she was just someone who blended into the background. Even when rehearsals for big events happened, she would be asked to stay out of the main hall or focus on cleaning nearby rooms. She never argued. She simply followed instructions and kept her head down. Still, she listened whenever she could. From hallways, from behind doors, from distant corners, she absorbed the sound of instruments tuning, musicians practicing, and speakers testing microphones. Every sound added something to her understanding. She never realized it, but she was slowly building a deep internal sense of rhythm and melody just by listening. One of the most important things about her was that she never tried to show off. Even when she felt something strongly inside, she kept it hidden. There were moments when she imagined what it would feel like to sit at the grand piano in the main hall, but she quickly pushed those thoughts away. It seemed impossible. People like her were not given chances like that. At least that was what she believed. The venue staff had their own way of treating people. Those in higher positions were always respected and given opportunities. Those in lower positions were expected to stay in their roles without stepping outside of them. She understood this unspoken rule very well. So she accepted her place quietly and focused on doing her job well. Still, there was something about her that set her apart, even if no one noticed it. It was the way she observed things carefully. While others rushed through tasks, she paid attention to details. She noticed how performers reacted before they started playing. She noticed how silence in a hall could feel just as powerful as sound. She noticed how a single wrong note could change the mood of an entire room. These observations stayed with her, building something inside her that she could not yet fully express. One evening, after a long event had ended and the guests had left, she stayed behind to clean the main hall. The space was unusually quiet. Chairs were scattered, soft lights were still on, and the stage stood empty. At the center of the stage was the grand piano used by performers. It was covered slightly to protect it from dust, but even under the cover it looked powerful and elegant. She paused for a moment while cleaning nearby. Her eyes drifted toward the piano. No one was watching. No one was around to tell her what to do or not do. For a brief moment, she felt something unusual inside her chest. It was not a clear thought, but more like a feeling she could not ignore. She slowly walked closer to the stage, as if something was quietly pulling her toward it. Standing near the piano, she hesitated. Her hands were slightly tense. She knew she was not supposed to be there in that way, but curiosity and emotion were stronger than hesitation. She gently lifted the cover and looked at the keys. They were clean, perfectly aligned, and waiting. She did not sit down. She did not play. She only looked at it for a long moment. In her mind, she imagined what it would feel like to touch those keys in front of an audience. Not just to play simple background music, but to create something that people would actually remember. But she quickly stepped back. The moment passed. She lowered her eyes and returned to her work, reminding herself that dreams like that were far away from her reality. She finished cleaning the hall and left quietly, just like she always did. That night, however, she could not sleep easily. The image of the piano stayed in her mind longer than usual. She kept thinking about the silence of the empty hall and how powerful it had felt. She did not know it yet, but something had already begun to shift inside her. Something small but important. And soon, without her expecting it, that quiet shift would lead her into a moment that would change everything she believed about herself. The next day at the venue began like any other. The sun had just started to rise when she arrived for work. The building was still quiet at that hour, with only a few staff members moving around to prepare for the day. She tied her hair back, took a deep breath, and started her routine tasks without thinking too much about the previous night. In her mind, she told herself it was just a passing moment, nothing important, nothing that would change anything. She cleaned the hallways, checked the tables in the dining area, and helped arrange chairs in one of the smaller rooms where a private meeting was scheduled. Everything followed the same pattern as always. There was comfort in that routine, kept her mind busy and helped her avoid thinking about things she believed were not meant for her. But something inside her was slightly different that day. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable even to herself. Every time she passed by the main hall, her steps slowed for just a second. She would glance toward the closed doors without meaning to. The image of the grand piano from the night before kept returning to her thoughts, even when she tried to push it away. She did not understand why it stayed with her. She had seen the piano many times before during events, but something about that quiet moment alone had left a deeper impression. It was not just the instrument itself, but the feeling she had experienced standing near it. A strange mix of curiosity, silence, and possibility. Still, she did not allow herself to think too deeply about it. She had work to do, and she reminded herself of her place in the structure of the venue. People like her did not step into the spotlight. They supported it. That was how things worked. By mid-morning, the venue became busier. Staff members moved quickly as preparations began for an important evening event. It was one of the most talked about gatherings of the month. Guests from different industries would be attending. There would be speeches, networking, and a live musical segment planned for the evening. She overheard bits of conversation while passing through the corridors. People were discussing final arrangements, seating plans, and performers who would be arriving later in the day. One name kept coming up repeatedly, the scheduled pianist for the night. He was known for his smooth performances and was expected to deliver the highlight of the musical segment. She did not pay much attention at first. It was not unusual for professional performers to be part of events like this. But as the day went on, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere among the staff. There was sudden urgency, quick movement, and a slightly tense energy in the air. Later in the afternoon, while she was organizing supplies in a storage room, she heard a commotion outside. Voices were louder than usual, and footsteps moved quickly across the hallway. She stepped out carefully to see what was happening. A staff coordinator was speaking with the event manager near the entrance of the main hall. Their expressions looked serious. She stayed at a distance, not wanting to interrupt, but close enough to hear fragments of their conversation. Something had gone wrong. The scheduled pianist was no longer able to attend. The reason was not fully explained, but it was clear that it was unexpected and urgent. The musical performance for the evening was still planned, and guests would soon begin arriving. There was little time to find a replacement. The atmosphere immediately changed. What had been a well-organized event now felt uncertain. People began discussing options quickly, trying to figure out what could be done. There was talk of calling other musicians, but time was running short. Most professionals were already booked for the day. She quietly stepped back into the storage room, not wanting to be seen. But even there, she could hear the tension building outside. It was the kind of situation that created pressure for everyone involved. After a few minutes, she heard footsteps approaching the storage area. The door opened slightly, and one of the senior staff members entered, looking stressed and focused. There was no time for long explanations. They needed someone to step in for the piano performance. It was meant to be a simple background piece at first, just enough to keep the program running smoothly. Nothing complex, nothing demanding. But still, it required someone who could sit at the piano and play in front of an audience. The staff member looked around quickly, as if searching for any possible solution. Then, almost without much thought, their eyes landed on her. She was surprised by the attention. She straightened slightly, unsure of what was about to be said. The request came quickly and directly. She was asked if she could play the piano. At first, she thought she had misunderstood. It was not something she had ever been asked before. She stood still for a moment, unsure how to respond. Her mind moved between disbelief and hesitation. She explained softly that she was not a trained performer. She had never played in front of people. She had no formal experience, no stage background, nothing that would make her suitable for such an important moment. But the situation outside was difficult. There were no other options available at that moment. Time was running out, and guests would soon begin arriving. The pressure was not just about the music anymore, it was about keeping the event from falling apart. The staff member looked at her again, this time with less certainty, but still with hope. There was no demand in the request, only urgency mixed with desperation. They did not ask her to perform something complicated, just a simple tune, something calm, something steady, enough to fill the space until a better solution could be found. She stood there quietly, listening to the request. Her first instinct was to refuse. Everything about the situation felt too big, too sudden, too far outside her world. She had never imagined being placed in such a position. But something inside her did not immediately say no. It was not confidence. It was not excitement. It was something softer, something uncertain, but persistent. A memory from the night before returned to her mind. The empty hall, the silent piano, the feeling she could not explain. For a moment, she said nothing. The staff member waited, clearly hoping for any kind of answer. She looked down at her hands. They were slightly tense. She thought about her life, her routine, and how carefully she had always stayed within boundaries. She thought about how invisible she usually was in this place. And then she thought about the piano, not as a performance instrument, but as something she had only ever touched in imagination. The request was still simple on paper. A single tune, nothing more. But for her, it felt like standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. The decision had not yet been made, but the moment had already begun to shift. Something unexpected was forming quietly in her mind. Something that would soon lead her into a situation she had never prepared for, and a path she had never considered walking. She stood in that small storage room for a few seconds that felt much longer. The air was quiet, but her mind was not. Outside, the venue was still in motion. People were moving fast, voices were rising and falling, and the pressure of the upcoming event was growing stronger with every passing minute. But inside that room, everything felt paused. The request had not been repeated, but it still stayed in the air like something unfinished. She could sense that the staff member was waiting, not pushing, just hoping. It was not a command. It was not an order. It was a situation where someone was needed, and she had somehow become the closest possible option. Her first instinct was still to step away from it. She had spent years staying in the background. Years of doing work that did not require attention or spotlight. Years of avoiding situations where eyes would be on her. And now, suddenly, she was being asked to sit in front of a piano in a hall filled with guests and play something that would be heard by everyone. Felt unreal. She tried to imagine herself walking onto that stage. She tried to picture the audience, the lights, the silence before the first note. Her mind immediately rejected the image. Felt too large, too exposed, too far from her reality. But then another thought quietly appeared. It was not loud. It did not push itself forward. It simply existed. A simple tune. That was all they were asking for. Not a performance. Not perfection. Just something to fill the moment. Something basic enough to keep the program moving. She looked at the piano differently in her mind now. Not as a dream instrument. Not as something she had secretly admired from a distance. But as a responsibility that had unexpectedly landed in front of her. Still, doubt remained strong. She finally spoke, her voice careful and low, explaining again that she was not trained, that she had never performed in front of anyone, that she could not guarantee anything. She was not trying to refuse in a harsh way. She was simply being honest about what she believed was her limitation. But the situation outside was becoming more urgent. The event timeline was tight. Guests would soon begin to enter the hall. The musical segment could not be removed without affecting the entire flow of the evening. The staff member listened, but there was no new solution appearing. There was only the same problem repeating itself with every passing second. And then something changed slightly in the tone of the conversation. Not pressure, not force, but a quiet appeal. Just help us keep things going. That sentence stayed with her. She looked down again, thinking. Her heart was not calm, but it was not running away either. It was something in between, uncertain, but awake. She remembered something from her past. Not a big event, not a defining moment, but small fragments. Moments when she had listened carefully to music playing in distant rooms. Moments when she had tried to match rhythms with her fingers on tables or surfaces when no one was watching. Moments when sound had always meant more to her than she had ever admitted. She had never been taught formally. That was true. But she had not been completely disconnected from music either. It had always been there in pieces. Still, stepping into the situation felt different. The staff member waited again, not adding more words this time. There was no more explanation needed. Everything was already understood. Either she would step in, or they would have to rush for another solution that might not arrive in time. She took a slow breath, and then she made a decision that even surprised her a little. She agreed. It was not confident. It was not bold. It was quiet, almost fragile, but it was still a decision. For a brief moment, the staff member looked relieved, as if a small weight had been lifted. There was no celebration, no excitement, only movement. The situation immediately shifted from problem to action. She was told she would only need to play something simple, something soft in the background while guests settled and the program began. She nodded, still trying to process what she had just agreed to. As they walked toward the main hall, her steps felt different. The corridors she had walked through countless times now felt unfamiliar. Every sound seemed sharper. Every movement around her seemed more noticeable. She kept her hands close to her sides, trying to stay steady. Her mind was still questioning the decision, but her body was already moving forward. When they reached the side entrance of the main hall, she paused for a moment before entering. Through the slightly open doors, she could see the space inside. It was already being prepared for the evening. Chairs were aligned. Soft lighting was being adjusted. The stage stood at the far end, calm and waiting. And there it was, the piano. The same instrument she had only ever observed from a distance or seen briefly in passing. But now it was no longer something distant. It was part of her next step. Her heart beat a little faster. The staff member gently guided her through the final instructions. She was told where to sit, when to begin, and that she would be signaled when the time came. Everything was explained in simple terms, as if trying to reduce the pressure as much as possible. She listened carefully, but part of her attention was already drifting toward the piano itself. The closer she got, the more real it became. She noticed small details she had never paid attention to before. The polished surface, the perfectly aligned keys, the way it stood alone on the stage as if it belonged there more than anything else in the room. For a brief moment, she felt the same strange feeling she had experienced the night before when she had stood alone in the hall. But this time it was not empty silence. This time there was purpose. She was guided to a waiting area just beside the stage. From there, she could hear the growing sound of guests entering the hall. Conversations began to fill the space. Soft greetings, footsteps, movement of chairs. The atmosphere slowly shifted from preparation to arrival. Her role was still small in description. A simple tune, background music. But in her mind it no longer felt small. It felt like something much more delicate. Something that could either blend into the moment or quietly change it. She sat there quietly, waiting for the signal. Her hands rested in her lap, slightly tense. She tried to calm herself, but her thoughts kept moving back and forth between doubt and acceptance. She was still not sure if she was ready, but she was already here. And in a few moments she would be sitting in front of that piano, in a hall full of people she had never imagined performing for, about to play something that she had never played in front of anyone before. The silence before the beginning felt heavier than anything she had experienced that day. And somewhere deep inside, without fully realizing it yet, she was standing right at the edge of something that would soon begin to change everything she thought she knew about herself. She sat quietly in the small waiting area beside the stage, trying to keep her breathing steady. The sound of the hall slowly filled up as more guests arrived. Conversations mixed together, footsteps moved across the polished floor, and soft greetings echoed under the tall ceiling. Everything around her felt alive in a way that made her more aware of her own stillness. Her hands were resting in her lap, but she could feel a slight tension in her fingers. She kept moving them slowly, as if that could calm her nerves. But the truth was simple. No amount of slow movement could fully settle what she was feeling inside. This was not like anything she had ever experienced before. She had been in this hall many times, but always as someone who stayed behind the scenes. Someone who moved quietly, cleaned quietly, and left quietly. Now, she was waiting to step onto the stage that she had always seen from a distance. The piano was just a few steps away, hidden partially from her view by the side curtain. But even without seeing it directly, she could feel its presence. Felt heavier in her mind now, more real than before. A staff member passed by and gave her a small, reassuring nod. There was no need for words. Everything had already been explained. She only needed to play a simple tune when the signal came. Simple. That word kept repeating in her mind. But simple did not feel simple anymore. Because now it meant doing something in front of people. It meant being seen. It meant being heard. She looked down at her hands again. They were steady enough but not completely calm. She had never performed in front of anyone before. Even the idea of being watched while playing made her chest feel tight. Still she stayed. She did not leave. She did not refuse. She remained in place, waiting for something she was not fully prepared for. The sound of the audience began to settle. Chairs stopped moving. Conversations slowly faded into soft whispers and then into silence. The event was about to begin. From where she sat, she could hear the faint sound of microphones being tested. A short announcement was made, welcoming the guests. The program was starting. Her moment was approaching. Her heart beat a little faster. She was told again that she would be signaled when to go. A simple cue. Nothing complicated. Just a moment to begin playing. She nodded without speaking. And then she waited. The first part of the program began. She could hear applause from the audience. A speech followed. Then another short introduction. Everything was moving in an organized rhythm. But inside her, time felt different. Every passing second felt longer. She tried to focus on her breathing again. In and out. Slowly. But her thoughts kept returning to the same question. What if she made a mistake? What if she pressed the wrong note? What if the silence around her turned into something uncomfortable? She had never carried this kind of responsibility before. Even though it was described as simple background music, it no longer felt small. It felt like stepping into something unknown. At one point, she almost convinced herself that she could still step away, that she could quietly tell someone she was not ready. But then she heard the next announcement. The musical segment was about to begin. Her body reacted before her thoughts could fully respond. She stood up. It was not sudden. It was slow, almost uncertain. But she stood. A staff member appeared immediately beside her and guided her gently toward the stage entrance. There was no rush in their movement, only quiet support. She took a slow breath as she walked. Each step felt heavier than the last. The side curtain was just ahead now. Through the small gap, she could see part of the audience. Rows of people sitting calmly, waiting. The lights were soft but focused toward the stage area. Her fingers tightened slightly. This was it. The staff member gave her a final small nod and stepped back. There was no turning back now. She stepped through the curtain. For a brief moment, she did not look at the audience. She focused only on the floor beneath her feet. She followed the path that had been prepared for her. The piano was waiting at the center of the stage. It looked different now that she was approaching it directly. Larger, more present, more real. She walked slowly toward it. The room was quiet, not completely silent, but quiet in a way that made every small sound feel noticeable. Her steps were soft against the floor. She reached the bench and paused for a second before sitting down. That small pause felt like a world of its own. She finally sat. Her hands hovered slightly above her lap for a moment before she placed them gently on the keys. The piano was smooth under her fingers, cool and still. She looked down at the keys without lifting her head. This was the moment she had agreed to. A simple tune. That was what she kept reminding herself. Just something simple. She closed her eyes for a brief second. And then she began. The first note was soft, careful, almost cautious. It was not perfect, but it was steady enough to begin. The sound traveled through the hall gently. She played the next few notes slowly, following the simple structure she had been told. At first, it felt like walking on unfamiliar ground. Every movement of her fingers required attention. Every note felt important. But something began to change. As she continued, her breathing started to match the rhythm of the music. The tension in her fingers began to loosen slightly. The fear did not disappear, but it shifted into focus. She was no longer just sitting in front of a piano. She was inside the sound. The simple tune continued, but something subtle began to happen. She added a slightly softer touch to certain notes without thinking too much about it. She adjusted timing in small ways that made the melody feel more natural. It was not planned. It was instinct. The sound became smoother, more connected. The audience, which had been quietly waiting, began to notice. At first, it was subtle. A few heads turned slightly toward the stage. Conversations had already stopped, but now attention became sharper. She did not see this. She was focused only on the piano. The music was still simple, but it no longer felt empty. There was something growing inside it. Something she had not been asked to add. Emotion. Her fingers moved more confidently now. The hesitation that was present at the beginning started to fade. She was still careful, but no longer frozen. The tune began to flow instead of hesitate. Each note followed the next more naturally. And slowly, without her fully realizing it, the space around her began to feel different. The hall was no longer just a room with an audience. It was becoming a space filled with sound that held attention. She was still following the idea of a simple tune, but it was no longer just simple. It was alive in a way she did not expect. And she was only just beginning to understand that something inside her had started to open without permission, leading her towards something far beyond what she had been asked to do. Her fingers continued moving across the piano keys, but something had already changed in the way she was playing. What started as a simple, careful tune was slowly turning into something more layered, something more expressive. She did not notice it at first. To her, she was still just following the instructions she had been given. But the feeling inside her was no longer the same as when she first sat down. At the beginning, Every note felt like a step on uncertain ground. Now the ground felt more stable. Her hands were still not perfect, but they were no longer shaking with hesitation. There was a flow building between her thoughts and her movements, even if she did not fully understand how it was happening. In the hall, the audience had completely changed their behavior. At first, many of them had expected background music, something soft, something forgettable, something that would simply fill the silence while they waited for the next part of the program. But slowly, that expectation began to fade. People who were still adjusting in their seats suddenly became still. Conversations that had been whispered earlier were gone completely. Even those who had only been half paying attention now found themselves looking toward the stage. The sound coming from the piano was not loud or dramatic, but it carried something that was hard to ignore. It had a kind of emotional weight that made people stop and listen without fully realizing why. She, however, was not aware of any of this. For her, the world had narrowed down to the piano and her own breathing. Her eyes were mostly focused on the keys, though sometimes she looked slightly ahead without really seeing the audience. Her mind was no longer filled with doubt in the same way it had been earlier. Instead, it was filled with something quieter. Concentration mixed with something she had never fully named before. Each note she played seemed to lead naturally into the next. It was not planned. It was not practiced. But it felt right in that moment. She adjusted small things without thinking too much about them. A slightly softer touch here. A slightly longer pause there. A gentle rise in intensity in certain parts of the melody. None of it was part of the original instruction she had been given, but it was happening anyway. The simple tune was no longer just simple. It was becoming something more emotional. In the audience, a few people exchanged quiet glances. Not because they understood music deeply, but because they could feel the shift. There was something about the performance that made them stop thinking about the event schedule or their conversations or their phones. They were just listening. Some leaned slightly forward in their seats. Others sat more upright without even noticing. It was as if the room itself had changed its temperature, becoming more focused, more present. On stage, she slowly started to sense something different too. At first, it was very subtle. She noticed that the sound seemed fuller than before. Not because the piano had changed, but because of how she was playing it. The way her fingers moved was becoming more confident. The hesitation she felt earlier had reduced without her realizing when it happened. There was still a small voice in her mind reminding her that she was not trained, that she was not supposed to be here in this way. But that voice was no longer strong enough to control her movements. Her hands were leading now, not in a wild or uncontrolled way, but in a natural flow that felt like it had been waiting for this moment. She moved into a slightly deeper section of the melody. The tone shifted. It became warmer, more expressive, and for the first time since she sat down, she lifted her head slightly. Not fully, but enough to feel the space around her. The lights above the stage were soft. The audience was quiet. The atmosphere felt different from anything she had experienced before in that hall. It no longer felt like she was doing something temporary. Felt like something was unfolding. Her breathing became more steady. The nervous energy that had been present earlier was still there in the background, but it was no longer controlling her. It had been replaced by focus. She continued playing. The melody grew in small layers. Not sudden changes, but gradual ones, like waves building gently instead of crashing. The audience remained silent, but their attention was now fully locked on her. Even those who had originally been distracted were now completely engaged. A few people closed their eyes, simply listening. Others watched her hands more closely, as if trying to understand how someone who had been introduced as a temporary replacement could play with such feeling. But there was no awareness of expectation in her mind. She was not thinking about impressing anyone. She was not thinking about the audience anymore. She was simply inside the music. As the piece continued, something else began to emerge. A sense of storytelling without words. The melody carried different moods as it moved forward. At one moment, it felt calm and gentle. At another, it carried a deeper emotional tone, almost like a memory being expressed through sound. She did not plan any of this. It was simply happening through her hands. And for the first time in a long while, she felt completely connected to what she was doing. Not as someone cleaning a hall, not as someone standing in the background, but as someone creating something in real time. The simple tune she had been asked to play was no longer recognizable in its original form. It had grown into something more layered, shaped by her emotion, her instinct, and the quiet experiences she had carried within her without expressing them. In the audience, the atmosphere became heavier in a calm way. Not heavy with sadness, but heavy with attention. People were fully present in the moment. Even the staff members near the side of the stage had stopped moving. They were watching quietly, surprised by what was unfolding. No one had expected this. Not from her. But on stage, she was no longer thinking about expectations at all. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence now. The fear she had felt earlier before sitting down had transformed into something else entirely. It was still there, somewhere in the background, but it no longer had control over her actions. She transitioned into a slightly stronger section of the melody. The sound became richer, more expressive. It was no longer just background music. It was a performance. But she did not realize that fully yet. To her, it still felt like she was simply following what felt natural. She was not trying to impress or transform anything. She was only following the flow that had started to build once she allowed herself to begin. And that flow was now carrying her forward, step by step, note by note, into something far beyond what anyone in that hall had originally expected from a simple tune. Her fingers moved across the piano with a calmness she had never felt before. The music was no longer something she was trying to control carefully. It had become something she was living inside. Every note felt like it belonged exactly where it was placed, as if the piano itself was guiding her rather than the other way around. In the hall, the silence had turned heavier, but in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are fully absorbed in something. No one was speaking. No one was moving unnecessarily. Even the small sounds of shifting in seats had stopped. All attention was on her. But she did not see it. She was still focused on the keys, on the movement of her hands, on the sound that was growing from something that was originally meant to be simple. The tune had changed now. It still carried the bass of what she was asked to play, but it had grown layers of emotion. It was softer in some moments, stronger in others, like it was telling a story without words. And that story was no longer small, felt wide, deep, real. Her breathing matched the rhythm of her playing. She was no longer thinking about mistakes or fear. That part of her mind had quieted down. What remained was focus, feeling, and flow. She shifted slightly on the bench, adjusting her posture without breaking the rhythm. Her hands moved with more confidence now. Even the small pauses between notes felt intentional, like they were part of something larger. In the audience, people were completely still. Some leaned forward slightly, as if trying to stay closer to the sound. Others sat back, letting it wash over them. A few had their hands resting quietly in their laps, forgotten in the moment. It was not loud music. It was not fast. But it carried something that held attention in a different way. It made people listen without effort. The staff members near the stage were no longer thinking about the schedule or the program flow. They were watching quietly, unsure of what they were witnessing. What was supposed to be a short, simple tune had turned into something entirely different. But no one interrupted. No one stopped her. Because something about the moment felt fragile, like breaking it would take away something important. On stage, she slowly moved into a softer section of the melody again. The notes became lighter, more delicate. It felt almost like a memory being touched gently. She did not know why she was playing this way. It was not planned. It was not taught. It was something that seemed to come from inside her without permission. A feeling she had carried quietly for a long time, now finding its way out through sound. Her hands moved with more freedom now. The earlier hesitation was completely gone. Even though she had never performed before, her movements no longer felt uncertain. They felt natural, as if the piano had been waiting for her in some way she did not understand. The melody rose slightly again. Not suddenly but gradually, like something building step by step. The audience felt it too. There was a shift in energy in the room. Not loud, not obvious, but present. People who had been simply listening now felt something deeper. It was not just sound anymore. It was emotion carried through sound. A few people exchanged quiet looks, but no one spoke. They did not need to. Everyone understood that something unusual was happening. On stage, she tilted her head slightly as she played a sequence that felt more expressive than anything before. Her fingers pressed the keys with gentle strength, creating a sound that filled the hall without overwhelming it. She still did not look at the audience directly. In her mind, there was no audience. Only music, only movement, only flow. For a moment, she closed her eyes while still playing. It was not planned. It just happened. And in that moment, the music felt even more connected, as if she was no longer separate from it. The melody continued smoothly, then shifted again. This time it carried a deeper tone. Not sadness exactly, but something reflective, something thoughtful, like looking back at things that were never spoken out loud. Her fingers slowed slightly, allowing the notes to breathe. Each pause felt meaningful. Each note felt placed with care. The hall remained completely silent. Even the smallest sound would have felt out of place now. She opened her eyes again, still focused on the piano. Her face showed concentration, but there was something calmer in her expression now. The tension she had walked in with was gone. It had been replaced with something steadier. Trust in the moment. Trust in herself even if she did not fully realize it yet. The melody began to build once more, this time with more strength. Not forceful but fuller. The sound filled the space more deeply, reaching the far corners of the hall. It was no longer something in the background of an event. It had become the center of attention. People who had originally come for a formal gathering were now experiencing something unexpected. Something emotional. Something they had not planned for. And none of it came from perfection. Came from feeling. On stage, she moved into the final part of the piece without knowing it was the final part. She was still following the natural flow of what she was playing. But the structure was slowly reaching a point of resolution. The melody began to soften again. Slower now. More gentle. As if it was slowly returning to silence after telling its story. Her hands followed this change without resistance. The energy in her playing shifted naturally, as if the music itself was guiding the ending. Each note now felt more spaced out, more meaningful, less about building and more about releasing. The audience could feel it too, a sense that something was coming to a close, but no one wanted it to end. Still, they remained silent, respectfully, completely present. She took a slow breath while continuing to play. Her fingers pressed the final few sequences with care. The melody was now soft, almost like a whisper compared to how it had begun. And then it happened. The final note. She held it gently, letting it fade naturally into silence. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment even after the sound ended. The hall did not move immediately. There was a pause. A quiet stillness that lasted a few seconds longer than expected. No one spoke. No one clapped right away. It was as if the audience needed time to return from where they had just been taken. She slowly lifted her hands from the piano and sat still. Only then did she look up. For the first time, she saw the audience clearly. Rows of people sitting in complete silence, looking toward the stage. And then, slowly the silence broke. Applause began. First it was gentle, then stronger, then filled the entire hall. She stayed seated for a moment, not fully understanding what was happening. Her expression was calm, slightly surprised, as she looked across the room. She had been asked to play something simple, but what she had just done was something far beyond that request. Still, she did not think of it that way. To her, it was just something that happened. Something that came out when she finally allowed herself to play without fear. She stood up slowly, a little unsure how to respond to the applause. Her hands were still slightly warm from the piano. She gave a small, uncertain nod and stepped back from the bench. The applause continued, but she began walking toward the side of the stage. The staff members watched her as she returned. Some still looked surprised, others impressed, but none of them said anything immediately. She reached the side curtain and paused for a brief moment before stepping behind it. Only then did the sound of the audience fully fade from her immediate space. Behind the curtain, it was quieter again, but something had changed, not just in the hall, but in her. She stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, as the realization began to settle in. She had walked in as someone asked to play a simple tune, and she had walked out as someone who had unknowingly transformed it into something no one would forget. And deep inside, even if she did not fully understand it yet, she had just taken the first step into a life that would no longer remain in the background.